Imagine waking up to a summer so brutally hot that rivers began shrinking, crops withered before harvest, and entire communities wondered how long their water would last. Now, imagine facing that nightmare without air conditioning. The summer of 1976 wasn't just another heat wave. It became one of the most relentless natural disasters modern Europe had ever experienced. For weeks, the rain refused to fall, the ground cracked beneath people's feet, and millions were forced to survive using nothing but determination, ingenuity, and the simplest methods passed down through generations. How did ordinary families endure scorching temperatures day after day? What desperate measures did governments take when water started running out? And could a summer like this happen again? This is the incredible true story of how Europe survived the Great Heatwave of 1976. If you enjoy deeply researched history documentaries that bring forgotten events back to life, subscribe now and join us as we uncover the moments that shaped our world one extraordinary story at a time. It didn't start as a disaster. In fact, for millions of people across Europe, the summer of 1976 seemed almost perfect. Spring had arrived with clear blue skies and unusually warm temperatures. Families planned beach holidays. Farmers welcomed the sunshine after a damp winter. Parks filled with children. Cafes spilled onto sidewalks, and newspapers celebrated what many believed would be a beautiful summer. But week after week, something unusual happened. The rain never came. At first, hardly anyone noticed. A few dry days turned into a few dry weeks. Then the weeks stretched into months. Rivers began flowing lower than normal. Reservoirs slowly shrank. Fields that should have been bright green faded into shades of yellow and brown. Meteorologists started watching the skies with growing concern. High-pressure systems settled over much of Western Europe, blocking the weather fronts that normally carried cool air and rainfall from the Atlantic. Day after day, the same forecast appeared. Clear skies, relentless sunshine, rising temperatures. Across countries like the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, thermometers climbed higher than people were used to seeing. Homes trapped the heat streets shimmered under the afternoon sun. Nights, which normally brought relief, stayed unusually warm. Most Europeans had never experienced anything like it. Back then, air conditioning was rare. In many homes, schools, hospitals, and offices, it simply didn't exist. People opened windows, drew their curtains, and hoped for a cool breeze that never seemed to arrive. Still, few believed the situation would become a national emergency. After all, every heat wave eventually ends. Or so they thought. No one realized they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most extraordinary summers in modern European history, a season that would empty reservoirs, destroy harvests, test governments, and force millions to discover how to survive when nature refused to show mercy. By June 1976, what had once seemed like a pleasant summer was beginning to worry scientists. The skies remained cloudless. Day after day, a stubborn high-pressure system parked itself over much of Western Europe, pushing away the Atlantic storms that normally brought cooler air and rain. Every sunrise looked almost identical to the one before it, bright, dry, and relentlessly hot. Then came July. The heat didn't simply continue, it intensified. Across the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Germany, temperatures climbed into the mid and upper 90s Fahrenheit. In several regions, records that had stood for decades were broken. Asphalt roads softened under the blazing sun. Railway tracks expanded in the heat, forcing trains to slow down. Inside homes, classrooms, and offices, the air became almost unbearable. Nightfall brought little relief. Warm air lingered long after sunset, leaving millions unable to escape the heat even while they slept. Hospitals began treating growing numbers of people suffering from dehydration, exhaustion, and heat-related illness. But the rising temperatures were only part of the crisis. The real danger was happening beneath people's feet. With almost no meaningful rainfall for weeks, rivers dropped to unusually low levels. Reservoirs that supplied drinking water steadily shrank. Farmers watched helplessly as wheat, barley, and pastureland turned brown under the relentless sun. Livestock struggled to find fresh grass or enough water. In parts of England, officials started warning that if the drought continued, water supplies could become critically low. Across Europe, local authorities monitored reservoirs almost daily, hoping for rain that simply refused to arrive. The extraordinary summer was no longer a curiosity. It had become a national emergency. What frightened experts most wasn't how hot Europe had become, was the realization that no one knew when the heat would end. Every new weather forecast delivered the same unsettling prediction. Another day of sunshine, another day without rain, and another step deeper into one of Europe's most unforgettable climate disasters. Imagine it is the middle of July, 1976. You wake up before sunrise because it is already too warm to sleep. The sheets are damp with sweat. The air in your bedroom feels heavy and still, as if the night never truly cooled down. You walk to the window and open it, hoping for a breeze. Nothing. Outside, the streets are unusually quiet. Shopkeepers are opening their doors early, trying to work before the worst heat arrives. Children carry bottles of water. Garden lawns have turned yellow. Dust rises from the ground where rain has not fallen in weeks. And remember, there is no air conditioning. In 1976, most homes across Europe did not have it. Neither did many schools, offices, hospitals, or factories. People relied on open windows, electric fans, shaded rooms, and whatever cool air they could find. By noon, the heat becomes oppressive. Inside apartments, curtains stay closed all day to block the sun. Families move from room to room searching for the coolest corner of the house. Office workers loosen their ties. Factory employees struggle through sweltering shifts. Elderly residents sit quietly near open windows, conserving energy and hoping the temperature will stop rising. Public swimming pools become crowded. Beaches fill with people seeking relief. Ice cream sells faster than it can be delivered. In some neighborhoods, children play around public fountains simply to cool their feet. But beneath these ordinary scenes, anxiety is growing. Every radio broadcast talks about the drought. Reservoirs are falling. Farmers are losing crops. Water companies warn people not to waste a single drop. Then evening arrives. The sun goes down, but the heat remains trapped in the buildings. Bedrooms stay warm. Sleep becomes difficult. Tempers grow short. Parents worry about their children. Hospitals grow busier. For millions of Europeans, the heat wave is no longer a weather event. It has become a test of endurance. And the hardest question is no longer how hot will tomorrow be. It is how many more days can we live like this? At first, the warnings sounded temporary. Use less water. Don't wash your car. Avoid watering your garden. Most people assumed the restrictions would last only a few days. But as the weeks passed, without rain, the situation grew far more serious. Across much of Europe, reservoirs continued to shrink. Rivers that normally carried thousands of gallons of water every second slowed to a trickle. Lake levels dropped, exposing cracked shorelines that had been underwater for years. Then the taps began to fail. In parts of the United Kingdom, local authorities imposed strict water restrictions. Millions of people were prohibited from using hoses to water lawns or fill swimming pools. Some communities experienced reduced water pressure, while others prepared emergency plans in case supplies ran dangerously low. For the first time in generations, many families realized that clean, running water they had always taken for granted was no longer guaranteed. Every drop suddenly mattered. People shortened their showers. Buckets replaced garden hoses. Water from washing. Vegetables were saved to keep flowers alive. Neighbors reminded one another to turn off dripping faucets. Conservation became part of everyday life. Meanwhile, the countryside was suffering even more. Streams disappeared. Small ponds dried into patches of cracked mud. Livestock crowded around shrinking watering holes, while farmers watched helplessly as fields baked beneath an unforgiving sun. Without moisture in the soil, crops struggled to survive, and each cloudless day made the damage worse. Government officials faced mounting pressure. Emergency meetings were held almost daily. Water companies searched for new ways to protect supplies, while meteorologists scanned weather maps for any sign of approaching rain. None appeared. The drought had become more than a seasonal inconvenience. It was now threatening agriculture, public health, and the daily lives of millions. Europe had endured wars, economic crises, and harsh winters before. But in the summer of 1976, an invisible enemy was spreading across the continent. Not through violence, not through disease, but through the slow, relentless disappearance of water. For city residents, the heat wave was exhausting. For farmers, it was devastating. By the height of the summer, fields that should have been alive with green crops had turned brittle and brown. Weeks without meaningful rain had drained the soil of its moisture. Wheat, barley, potatoes, and vegetables struggled to grow under the relentless sun. Every passing day brought another loss that could not be reversed. Many farmers had spent months preparing for the harvest. Now, they watched an entire season disappear before their eyes. Pastures dried out so completely that cattle and sheep ran out of fresh grass to eat. In some regions, farmers were forced to feed their animals with winter hay months earlier than planned. It was a desperate decision, one that left many wondering how they would keep their livestock alive when winter finally arrived. The drought reached beyond the farms. Fruit orchards produced smaller harvests. Vegetable yields declined. Across parts of Europe, food production fell sharply, and agricultural losses climbed into the billions in today's money. Rural communities, whose livelihoods depended on successful harvests, faced an uncertain future. For many farming families, this wasn't just about crops. It was about generations of hard work. Parents looked across fields their grandparents had cultivated, wondering if they could recover from the damage. Every sunrise brought another cloudless sky. Every sunset ended with the same unanswered prayer for rain. Even wildlife struggled to survive. Ponds vanished. Fish died in warming rivers where oxygen levels dropped. Birds searched for water that no longer existed, while forests became dangerously dry, increasing the risk of wildfires. The Great Heatwave of 1976 was no longer simply a story about extreme temperatures. It had become a human story, a story of families watching their livelihoods wither, a story of communities learning that nature could change everything in a single season. And as the drought tightened its grip on Europe, one frightening question echoed from the countryside to the cities. If the rain still doesn't come, what happens next? By August 1976, it was clear that this was no longer just a difficult summer. It had become a national emergency. Across Europe, government officials gathered in emergency meetings as drought conditions worsened. Every new report painted the same troubling picture: reservoirs were shrinking, rivers were falling, farms were suffering, and millions of people depended on water supplies that were running dangerously low. The question was no longer whether action was needed. It was whether the action would be enough. In the United Kingdom, authorities introduced some of the strictest water-saving measures many people had ever seen: hosepipe bans spread across affected regions. Residents were urged to use only the water they truly needed. Every gallon saved could make a difference if the drought continued. The British government even appointed a special minister for drought, a remarkable sign of just how serious the crisis had become. Local councils worked alongside water authorities, preparing emergency plans in case reservoirs dropped to critical levels. Elsewhere in Europe, governments issued similar warnings. Farmers received emergency assistance where possible, while officials closely monitored rivers, reservoirs, and drinking water supplies. Meteorologists updated forecasts daily, but the maps showed little reason for hope. The skies remained stubbornly clear. Meanwhile, firefighters were placed on high alert as forests and grasslands became dangerously dry. A single spark could ignite a fast-moving blaze. Across the countryside, emergency crews prepared for disasters that had once seemed almost unimaginable. Yet despite every meeting, every restriction, and every public announcement, there was one thing no government could control: the weather. No law could force clouds to form. No emergency order could make rain fall. Europe's leaders had slowed the crisis, but they could not stop it. As August stretched on, millions looked toward the horizon, searching for dark clouds that never appeared. The fate of an entire season and, perhaps much more, still rested on a single force beyond human control: the sky. While governments issued warnings and experts monitored the drought, ordinary families faced a simpler challenge. How do you survive another day of relentless heat? In the summer of 1976, there were no smartphones sending weather alerts. Home air conditioning was still uncommon across much of Europe. Most people had only their routines, their resourcefulness, and the support of their neighbors. Each morning began early. Families opened every window before sunrise, trying to capture the coolest air of the day. As the sun climbed higher, windows were shut, curtains were drawn, and shutters were closed to keep the heat outside. Homes became dim and quiet, almost as if they were hiding from the sun itself. Water became too valuable to waste. Parents filled pitchers before local demand peaked. Bath water was used sparingly. Gardens were left to dry, while every extra drop was saved for drinking or cooking. Children were reminded to turn off faucets immediately, a lesson that many would remember for the rest of their lives. Daily routines changed as well. Construction workers, farmers, and laborers started before dawn whenever possible, finishing the hardest tasks before the afternoon heat became dangerous. Shops adjusted their hours. Parks emptied during the hottest part of the day, only filling again as evening approached. Communities looked after one another. Neighbors checked on elderly residents living alone. Families shared drinking water when supplies were limited. Local volunteers visited vulnerable people, making sure they had enough food, shade, and water to get through another scorching day. For many children, the summer felt strangely unforgettable. School holidays stretched beneath endless blue skies. Public fountains became gathering places, rivers and beaches filled with families searching for relief, even as the water levels continued to fall. But behind those memories was a constant uncertainty. Every morning began with the same question: would today finally bring rain? For weeks, the answer remained no. Yet through patience, cooperation, and remarkable resilience, millions of ordinary people endured one of the harshest summers modern Europe had ever experienced, proving that sometimes survival depends not on extraordinary technology, but on ordinary people refusing to give up. When the Great Heatwave of 1976 finally began to loosen its grip, Europe was not the same continent it had been just a few months earlier. The skies would eventually bring rain, but they could not erase what had already been lost. Across thousands of farms, the damage to crops and livestock left lasting financial scars. Many farming families spent years recovering from the drought, while some never fully did. Governments were forced to recognize that extreme weather was no longer a rare possibility. It was a national risk that demanded long-term planning. The crisis exposed weaknesses few people had noticed before. Water systems that had seemed reliable suddenly proved vulnerable during prolonged drought. Reservoirs, pipelines, and emergency supplies were carefully reviewed. New strategies were developed to better manage water during future dry spells, and conservation became a much more serious public conversation. The summer also changed the way scientists studied weather. Meteorologists began examining the unusual atmospheric patterns that had trapped high pressure over Western Europe for weeks. Researchers collected valuable data that would later help improve long-range forecasting and deepen the understanding of prolonged heatwaves and droughts. For ordinary people, however, the memories were far more personal. They remembered brown fields where green grass once grew. They remembered rivers that seemed to disappear. They remembered sleepless nights, empty reservoirs, and the constant hope that tomorrow's forecast would finally bring rain. For an entire generation, the summer of 1976 became the benchmark against which every future heatwave would be measured. Whenever temperatures climbed decades later, one phrase was often heard across parts of Europe: "It's starting to feel like 1976 again." That single year became more than a date in history. It became a warning, a reminder that even the most advanced societies remain dependent on something they cannot control: the weather. And although Europe would face other record-breaking heat waves in the decades that followed, the summer of 1976 proved a lesson that has never been forgotten. Nature doesn't have to arrive suddenly to change history. Sometimes it changes the world one hot, rainless day at a time. Then, almost as suddenly as it had disappeared, the rain came back. After months of relentless sunshine and cloudless skies, dark clouds finally gathered over parts of Western Europe. For millions of people, the first drops of rain were more than just a change in the weather. They were a moment of relief. Children rushed outside to feel the cool water on their faces. Families stood at their windows, watching the dry streets slowly darken beneath the falling rain. Farmers looked toward the sky, in silence, hoping it wasn't just another passing shower. For the first time in weeks, the air felt different, cooler, fresher, alive. But even as the drought began to ease, its scars remained. The rain could refill reservoirs over time, but it could not instantly restore months of lost crops. Fields that had turned to dust would take seasons to recover. Livestock that had already been sold or lost could not simply be replaced. Across rural communities, the financial damage would linger long after the clouds had passed. Cities also faced the aftermath. Water restrictions were gradually lifted, but conservation remained on everyone's mind. Officials carefully studied what had gone wrong, determined to prepare for the next extreme weather event. The heat wave had exposed just how fragile modern infrastructure could become when nature pushed it beyond its limits. For ordinary families, however, the greatest change was invisible. The summer of 1976 became a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. They remembered sleeping with every window open. They remembered carrying buckets of water. They remembered watching the ground crack beneath their feet and wondering if the rain would ever return. Years later, grandparents would tell their children and grandchildren about the summer that never seemed to end. Not because it was the hottest vacation they ever had, but because it taught them a lesson no one could forget. That even in the modern world, humanity still depends on the simplest gift of all, a sky willing to send rain. Nearly half a century has passed since the Great European Heatwave of 1976. The roads have changed. The cities have grown. Technology has transformed the way we live. Today, millions of homes are equipped with air conditioning, weather satellites can track storms from space, and meteorologists can forecast dangerous heat days in advance. Governments have emergency response plans that simply did not exist in 1976. But one question still remains. Could it happen again? The answer is yes. In the decade since 1976, Europe has experienced several major heat waves, some even hotter than the one that shocked an entire generation. Scientists have learned that prolonged periods of extreme heat are becoming more likely in many parts of the world, placing greater pressure on water supplies, agriculture, power grids, and public health. Yet history reminds us of something equally important. Technology alone cannot defeat nature. Air conditioning can cool a room. It cannot refill an empty reservoir. Emergency warnings can save lives. They cannot make rain fall. The summer of 1976 was never just a story about unbearable temperatures. It was a story about resilience. It was about neighbors helping neighbors, families adapting to extraordinary hardship, communities learning that survival often depends on cooperation as much as preparation. That summer proved that ordinary people could endure extraordinary circumstances when they worked together. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. History is not only a record of disasters, it is a record of human courage. The courage to adapt, the courage to endure, and the courage to hope even when every forecast predicts another cloudless day, as we face an uncertain future shaped by increasingly extreme weather. The summer of 1976 stands as both a warning and an inspiration, because history has already shown us that the greatest challenge is not the heat itself. It is how we choose to respond to it. And if another summer like 1976 arrives, the question won't be whether we remember history. The question will be whether we learned from it. If this story reminded you how powerful history can be, Subscribe and join us for more true stories that change the world. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and until our next journey into the past, stay curious, stay prepared, and never stop learning from history.